Picture a harbor bustling with activity, the scent of salt water mingling with that of crates loaded with precious goods. It's Boston in the year 1773, a city caught in the growing tensions between the American colonists and the British Crown. On the surface, it may seem like just another day, but beneath the tranquil facade, resentment is simmering. The colonies are frustrated. Taxes are being imposed by a distant government with no representation. The townspeople speak in hushed tones, their voices growing louder in backrooms and taverns, frustration spilling into the streets. The British East India Company's tea, sitting in the harbor, becomes a symbol of control. This is not just about tea, it's about freedom, it's about power, and it's about defiance. A rebellion is brewing, one that will set the colonies on a path towards revolution. But how far are these colonists willing to go to challenge the world's mightiest empire? The Boston Tea Party is about to unfold, and it will change everything. This is the story of that fateful night, when ordinary citizens did the extraordinary. Taxation and turmoil, the road to protest. Tensions between the American colonies and the British Empire began to mount with the enactment of various taxation laws. The Stamp Act of 1765 and the Townshend Acts of 1767 had already left a bitter taste in the mouths of colonists. Then came the Tea Act in 1773, which gave the British East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting colonial merchants. To the colonists, this wasn't just an economic blow, it was a direct affront to their autonomy. Boston, a city buzzing with discontent, was ground zero for the resistance against British control. It wasn't just about the taxes, it was the lack of representation in the decisions that affected their lives. The colonists' cries of, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry for all. They held town meetings and gathered in secret, determined not to let British dominance go unchecked. It was in these meetings that influential figures like Samuel Adams stoked the flames of rebellion. They saw the Tea Act as a test, an attempt by Britain to see if the colonies would submit or resist. They began to organize, rallying the public and creating a coalition that stood against the British rule. They knew that if they failed to act, Britain would continue its exploitation unchecked. In late November of 1773, ships carrying East India Company tea arrived in Boston Harbor. The colonists refused to let the cargo be unloaded, insisting that the tea be sent back to Britain. The governor of Massachusetts, however, was resolute, ordering that the tea remain in the harbor until it was paid for. The stage was set for a direct confrontation, and it was only a matter of time before words turned into action. The city was at a standstill, and it seemed there was no peaceful resolution in sight. Tensions grew higher each day, and something had to give. The colonists felt their voices were being ignored, their rights trampled underfoot. It was time for a drastic response, an act of defiance that would demand attention. The spark ignites. Planning the Tea Party. Samuel Adams and other leaders knew that drastic measures were needed. They began to secretly organize a response to the Tea Act, something that would send a powerful message to both the British Crown and the colonists. On December 16, 1773, Adams gathered a group at the Old South Meeting House, where the fate of the tea would be discussed. The crowd was restless, anxious for action. As the hours passed, emotions boiled over, and it was clear that talking would no longer suffice. Adams spoke passionately, signaling that the time for words had passed and the time for action had arrived. The colonists, dressed in everyday clothing and disguised as Mohawk warriors, quietly made their way toward Griffin's Wharf. They were about to make history. The disguise was symbolic. The Native American attire was not just about concealment, but about representing a break from British control. These men were taking matters into their own hands. By disguising themselves, they declared that they were not subjects of Britain but part of something new, something distinctly American. The plan was risky, but they were united in their determination. As night fell, the group made their way to the docks, their footsteps silent but their purpose loud and clear. There was no turning back now. They were determined to show the British government that they would not be oppressed without consequence. The ships sat waiting in the harbor, unaware of the storm that was about to be unleashed upon them. The colonists moved with a sense of urgency, every moment filled with anticipation. They were about to strike at the very symbol of British economic power, the tea. This act, they hoped, would echo far beyond Boston, rallying others to their cause. It was a moment of unity and defiance, an act that would be remembered for generations. The night of Defiance, the Boston Tea Party. On the night of December 16, 1773, the colonists boarded the ships Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver. They moved quickly, determined to complete their mission before the British authorities could intervene. With hatchets and determination, they began to break open the crates. The dark waters of Boston Harbor were soon filled with the floating leaves of British tea. For 3 hours, the men worked in silence, dumping 342 chests of tea into the harbor. The value of the tea was enormous, but to the colonists, it was a necessary sacrifice. They knew that their actions would not go unnoticed. They were sending a message to the British Crown, that the colonies would no longer be subjected to unjust laws. The scene was surreal, dozens of men, united in defiance, taking a stand against one of the most powerful empires in the world. The tea, once a symbol of British economic power, was now nothing more than refuse in the water. The crowd that had gathered on the shore watched in silence, knowing they were witnessing history in the making. The colonists took great care to ensure that nothing but the tea was destroyed. They were not vandals, they were patriots making a point. This was an act of protest, not of wanton destruction. As the final chests were emptied, the men quietly disbanded, disappearing into the night. The Boston Tea Party was over, but its impact was just beginning. The colonists had made their point, they would not stand by and be exploited. They had taken a stand against tyranny, and in doing so, had set in motion events that would lead to revolution. The echoes of that night would resonate across the colonies, sparking both hope and fear. Echoes of resistance, aftermath and response. News of the Boston Tea Party spread quickly throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic. To many colonists, the act was a bold statement of resistance, inspiring similar sentiments throughout the American colonies. But to the British government, it was an outright act of rebellion that could not go unpunished. King George III and his ministers were furious, determined to bring the colonies back under control. In response, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These laws were meant to punish Boston and Massachusetts for their defiance, closing Boston Harbor and stripping away colonial self-governance. The British believed that this would isolate the rebels and bring order back to the colonies. Instead, it had the opposite effect, uniting the colonies in their fight against British oppression. The Intolerable Acts led directly to the formation of the First Continental Congress in 1774. Representatives from across the colonies gathered to discuss a collective response to British actions. It was becoming increasingly clear that peaceful negotiation with Britain was unlikely. The seeds of revolution had been sown, and there was no turning back. The Boston Tea Party had galvanized the colonies, making it clear that they could resist British authority. The idea of independence was no longer a distant dream, it was becoming a tangible possibility. This act of defiance had shown that the colonies had the strength and resolve to stand up for their rights. It was the spark that would ignite the American Revolution. The events in Boston showed that the fight for liberty was just beginning. The colonists knew that greater challenges lay ahead, but they were ready to face them. The unity displayed in Boston spread, connecting colonies that had once been divided. The road to revolution was dangerous, but it was a path that the colonists were willing to take together. The Boston Tea Party was not just a protest, it was a turning point. It marked the moment when the colonies decided they would no longer tolerate the overreach of the British Crown. What began as an act of defiance against a single tax would soon blossom into a full-fledged fight for independence. The colonists had shown that they were willing to risk everything for their freedom, and this act of defiance became a beacon of hope. It united the colonies, inspired others to resist, and forced Britain to reveal the lengths it would go to maintain control. The tea may have sunk to the bottom of Boston Harbor, but the spirit of rebellion floated high above the waves. The Boston Tea Party was the catalyst that set the colonies on the path to revolution, and the world was about to witness the birth of a new nation. As we look back at that night, we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to do for our freedom, and what sacrifices will history remember us for? Thank you for watching. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment if you enjoyed the content and see you in our next video.